Well, hello, great to be with you. I know that here and across all parts of the country, even south, it's been extreme winter. So I hope you've survived that. It's one of those things when we have a time and season for all things. There's even that time and season for winter weather. But we're going to jump in today to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. We began it last week, and we're going to conclude it this week, and we're going to look at the entirety of it. And there's a lot to say here. Now, generally, remember chapter 7 is a turning point. In the lead up, in those first 6 chapters, we see Solomon in all of his wisdom, basically kind of in a state of vexation. His wealth, his power, the the big time living that he had with all of his possessions and things, he realized it was all vanity. And he said that phrase over and over again as he says the phrase about seeing things under the sun. But now, in chapter 7, it's reflections with that truth in mind of how to live under the sun. And we began it last week, and in part 2 this week, in the conclusion, we're going to turn specifically to reflections on righteousness. So maybe even put that seed in your mind as I take just a minute to kind of build us up to where we're at. Very quickly, I want to just share a few comments on the first part of the chapter, and then we'll conclude with these reflections on righteousness. So, living under the sun, he says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. And so one thing we see in these reflections, and it's often true in the Gospels, and as Jesus taught us in parables, there would at times be apparent contradictions. And so I think we can understand the good name, and ultimately it's something that we have on this earth, but it's more important, something eternally. And I shared this beautiful quote from Spurgeon last time, that we need to make sure that we're that we have our name written in his book of life. That we must have our name there. That's paramount. And that's better than any possessions, any ointment, anything else. We protect our name. But what about this idea of the day of death being better than birth? That seems so contradictory. But if we do have our name in that book of life, if we know that, that is a precious thing, and actually our birth and all the days of our life are days which we often struggle, where we learn lessons. And so the Christian, and it's a difficult place to reach, but we're kind of hard-pressed between the two, as Paul says, because we desire in our wrestling to be ultimately with Christ. So death will be the end of the conflict, and for those that have gone before us and that day that comes before us, that is an important truth. It's a difficult truth, but it's one that we get in our heart. There's other contradictions, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. You can look back at the message last week. But he talks about how mourning can actually teach us more than our laughter, and that's certainly true. You can reflect upon that. We learn during adversity, sadness, mourning, we're stretched. And he gives us lots of lessons for living. He again talks about this idea of wisdom in the house of mourning. Better is the end of the thing than the beginning. About the dangers of reflecting too much on the former days and wanting to go back in time. But ultimately, what we need to do with all this is consider the work of God. And what he's saying here is not that it's crooked and that it's evil, but it can be difficult to understand. And it's God who makes things straight. So in this first part, he's giving us some apparent contradictions. He's giving us meditations of wisdom. But I like this transition as we end this first half of the chapter and segue into our second half. Really, we're always almost in two states. We're enjoying prosperity, and when so, we should enjoy it. We absolutely should, and realize that it is the gift of God that has given us that. And we acknowledge him as the source. We're thankful for it. We're blessed. But we also have to consider the day of adversity, which we inevitably face, and some are in it now. We'll all be in it at times. But God is in control, and He has a purpose. He has a lesson for us. He has an opportunity. And in this first half, we understand that as we go through this thing called life, with the prosperity and the adversity, we trust. We trust at the very end that God will make all things good. All right. I know that was very quick. But let's now conclude the chapter and meditate further, specifically on the idea of righteousness. So I want you to think about that before we even start. Think of looking at a gem, and you can see different kinds of reflections. You look at it from different angles. So there's different parts to this, and it's going to begin with another apparent contradiction. So Solomon, again, reminds us of his experience. He said he's seen everything. But he says this, there is a righteous man, reflections on righteousness, but he perishes in his righteousness. That doesn't make any sense. But there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing, so that doesn't seem to make sense. And that's why it said something is crooked, it's hard to make it straight. Crooked, again, means difficult. He's going to talk later in this chapter about it being deep. You know, we'd like there to be a formula, but let's be honest in life. Do we sometimes see evil people that appear to prosper? They can prosper certainly with a lot of money. They can have power. They may even live a long life. And sometimes there's a person who seems to be right with God. They seem to be righteous, but they perish. Think of a book on this topic called When God Doesn't Make Sense, or we think He doesn't make sense. We see a person and they seem like they're living so rightly. How do they pass away? Now, in general, there's blessing in righteous living, and without a doubt, in the end, in eternity beyond a doubt, it absolutely makes a difference. But in this temporal vapor, there are times when the unrighteousness, back in time, Pharaoh, Herod, if you remember the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, there's many others, and we can see it in our present day. I'm not going to name names in our present day. You can think about that. They seem like it seems like the formula doesn't make sense. I remember in our study of Job. Job was a righteous man, yet he had all these bad things happen. And I think about Jesus, and they came to him and said, you know, why is this person sick? Was it because of his sin or his parents? And Jesus said, it's none of these. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. So, yes, we should have a desire to live a righteous life, but we have to be careful with these formulas. We live in a fallen world. And in this vanity, this temporal vapor, things, it doesn't always work according to our formula. More reflections on righteousness. Now, again, we got to disentangle some of this. These passages are not easy. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? But be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Well, what does he mean here? How could you be, when you're righteous, isn't that a good thing? So one, we have to give some explanation of this wording. Think of the idea of self-righteous. You know, and we're going to have a little bit more in the very next passage on it. How much self-righteous should I have? Or how much over-righteous should I extend to others versus having grace? Sometimes we're a little too wise. We're out to catch that person in every little jot and tittle of the law, kind of like a Pharisee. We're overly trying to be putting ourselves in the place of God, or we're also overly. I think of the parable Jesus taught, where there's the person who looked up and was so proud before God that he was so righteous, and there was another who would not even turn his eyes towards heaven because he realized his sin. And Jesus said, who went away justified. We have to be careful with self-righteous and overly righteous, or extending an over-righteousness in our judgment of others. Now, the other extreme is like, well, I'm under grace. I'll live as wicked as I want. That's not good either. There's this balance of life. When our righteousness comes from God. In myself, I don't have righteousness. There's a point that I need to have grace towards other people, but I certainly don't need to live a life of wickedness. But in the end, if we fear God, we will come out. If we trust in God, God can protect us. He can save us from our wicked sins. He can protect us from our self-righteousness. In either case, we need to extend ourselves to God. It's really His righteousness alone that will save us. In a lot going on in this passage. The first point, I think, will be relatively easy to understand. The importance of wisdom. And throughout this book and other, Solomon was a man, that's what he sought in his life, was wisdom. In wisdom there is strength. It's more than other rulers. It's more than riches. Wisdom is something to seek, and I think we can grasp that. But verse 20 is really, I would say, one of the top very few tenets of our faith. It's how we even come to God at all. Again, I've entitled this, I see various reflections or angles of righteousness. The reason I can't be self-righteous about this idea of not being overly righteous is I've sinned. He says there's not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. I think of the Romans road of the gospel that says, all have sinned. We've all fallen short. All of our righteousness is but a filthy rag. That's why we cannot be overly righteous. There's truly not one of us that can earn our own salvation. The only way to come to the gospel, to understand the need for Christ, is to understand that He alone is our righteousness. There's not a righteous person on this earth. That's also why we need to be careful about being overly righteous and not being a hypocrite about others. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. But, listen, your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. We think about, this is just one example. We look at what somebody else has done and we judge them. We're overly righteous, knowing we got a plank in our own eye that needs to be plucked out if we're going to help others. So these things, he said, again, each of these I could spend much more time on. You may want to spend time reflecting on them. But these things are very, very deep. The idea of righteousness, meditating on it, it's crucial to our salvation. It's crucial to our walk as Christians. But notice something else. These deep things, written so long ago, notice how they line up, all these things with it. I could give you a gospel account. I could give you a teaching of Jesus. I can give you a teaching in the New Testament with Paul that line up with the things here. Okay, we're going to end with a passage I had to wrestle with for a little bit. Let's see what you think. And I'm going to say what this is saying and what this is not saying, and then I'm going to talk about 3 truths of it. All right, the last reflection of righteousness. We've had quite a few here. I turn my heart to know and to search out and seek wisdom in the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death. The woman whose heart is snares and nets and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Well, first of all, I'm going to say 3 truths in this passage. This is my own reflection. Maybe you would have others. But what about what this is saying about a woman and what it's saying, what it's not saying? Well, one, I'm going to be honest, Solomon himself had hundreds and hundreds. He had wives, he had concubines. That was one of the ways that he did not withhold himself. And there were times they led him away. Now, is he saying that women are the source of evil? Absolutely not. It is not saying that. What about it says, a woman among these I have not found? There is a danger for men and women in wrong relationships and pursuing the wrong things in our vain lives. But this is not saying women are the source of evil or anything like that. So what about man? Well, we already know there's not any righteous, and that I could flip this and say that there's also men who lead women into terrible relationships as well. It's part of the struggle of life. But what about this when he says, one man amongst 1,000 I found? Well, I'm perhaps looking into this, but there was one man in all the earth. There's only been one righteous, and he was a man, the man Jesus. By one man, Adam, we all fell into sin, but by one man, we can be made righteous. That man is Jesus. He is the one amongst 1,000. Is this prophetic here? Is this looking to the one man? But there is only one man. And so our righteousness is found through God and through that one man. Men and women, all of us upon this earth, with the exception of that one man. God made the world in Genesis upright. All things were good. We fell into sin. And so that's why we have the vanity of all the book of Ecclesiastes and the reality of the sin. But the most important thing about the gospel is reflecting on righteousness, 2 parts. Woman, man, me, you. We cannot be self-righteous. We cannot save ourselves. We've all sinned. We're all unrighteous. But there is a righteousness in one man. And that man is Jesus. That God made to reconcile him to ourselves. In this world there are many schemes that lead us away from this eternal truth. But this is the most important thing. I know I feel like I'm going so fast today. I try to make these at a reasonable length. All I can do is share my thoughts. Most importantly, I encourage you to reflect upon the Scriptures, and I really encourage you to reflect upon true righteousness.